All right, we're going to make every effort to record the session right now, and we'll get started. We're going to talk today about, about Kanban. So thank you so much, those of you intrepid folks who have been waiting this out and are ready to get started. So today we're going to talk about Kanban, and I'll start by explaining a little bit about just what Kanban literally means, and then we'll talk about why it's hot right now, and then we'll talk a little bit about what you can do to get started and how you can make it work for you and your organization. I've got Stephen Borg here with me on the call as well as Laura, so if you have questions during the session, please feel free to throw those in the IM panel, and I'll do my best to work the answers in. Of course, it's going to be slightly abbreviated today because we're starting late. We may go a little bit late, but I'll try to make sure that we pack all the value in before 9 o'clock because I know that many of you will need to leave and go about your business for the day. So thanks for joining us. Kanban literally means, it's Japanese of course, it literally means visual card or visual board, and it comes to us from the Toyota production system. As far back as 1962, Taiichi Ohno, the head of Toyota, was describing the systems that they used to make Toyota manufacturing so effective and so efficient. As we now know, the techniques that they used in Toyota manufacturing helped propel them to become the most profitable and the most one of the largest companies in the car companies in the world, and also to be known for the highest quality cars. I drive a Toyota. I love my Toyota. They're really well made. They're known for that. And so this is what Taiichi Ohno says the Toyota production system was all about way back then. Just-in-time development, we're going to talk a little bit about that, and automation with a human touch. And he also then exposes that the tool that they're using to operate the system is Kanban, that visual card or visual board system. So in 2001 was the first publication of a book in the American market called The Toyota Way. And it was an examination of Toyota's techniques and practices and how those could be expanded to be used throughout business. And this has now become something that's called lean management. It started out as lean manufacturing and has spread into other forms of different kinds of business management. We'll talk a little bit about lean principles today as well. But Kanban really derives from the ideas that are behind lean, and there's some interesting synergies that we can take advantage of as software teams to try to connect up with our business and get a lot of support for the changes that we want to make in our development processes. So that first introduction of the Toyota ideas in terms of management was 2001. And then in 2005, David J. Anderson published this book, Kanban, in which he talks about how the ideas behind Kanban can be further refined to be used specifically for software development. One of the things that is sort of people's first impression when we talk about the fact that Kanban comes to us from manufacturing is to point out what we know, which is that we're not manufacturing stuff. We're not an assembly line. That's not what we're doing. Software development is quite different. And so it's worth noting that when we talk about Kanban, we're taking inspiration from the Toyota way, but we're not trying to turn ourselves into an assembly line of repeatable parts. We know we're not that. And we're going to talk about what some of those differences are. How can we use those ideas but use them in our situation? Alrighty, so depending on who you ask, there's a lot of different pillars that make up Kanban. In some cases, we'll talk about two pillars, respect for people and a commitment to continuous improvement. Those are certainly ideas that are at the heart of Kanban, and they exist as part of the lean ideals as well. Sometimes we talk about 5 pillars: visualizing work, making policies explicit, such as definitions of done, limiting work in process, focusing on flow, and there's commit to continuous improvement again. Or sometimes we have 3 pillars: making work visible, limiting work in process, and helping work flow. You can see that some themes are emerging, and we will talk about those core themes and core practices that make up Kanban. I've been thinking over the last couple days of just trying to understand how we can put some practical structure around Kanban, and that's really, I think, what David J. Anderson's book is all about, is sometimes because there's so many different ideas and they're so theoretical, conceptual, they can become confusing or not clear how to do them effectively. So that's what we want to try to do, is bring those back to software and make them effective. This is what David J. Anderson says about first implementing Kanban. And so as we talk about getting started with Kanban in a software organization, probably the first and most important thing to understand is that it's going to be an incremental process. You're going to start by understanding where you are at now, and then you're going to incrementally identify your own opportunities for improvement and put those improvements into place. There are some specific recommendations that will make you Kanban, that will make you lean, that you might try first, but really the bottom line is that it's up to you and your team. The opportunities for improvement that you see that you want to tackle first are the ones that you're going to do. This really illustrates the idea that you're not fundamentally changing the structure of your organization at first, though you may very well do that over time. You will do that in a self-directed way. But unlike other methodologies, and we especially contrast Kanban with Scrum, of course, we don't have new roles, new job descriptions. We don't reconfigure the teams initially. We don't change what activities people are doing. We don't necessarily change the steps that you use to develop the software. If you're waterfall right now, we're going to start by really understanding how your waterfall system works, and then we're going to figure out what direction we want to take. So it isn't necessarily even going to force you to be agile, although what you will find is that in order to make the things effective that Kanban wants to make effective, you will be gravitating towards things that are exactly the same as what we've been teaching in Agile all along. Those same things will be the things that will make Kanban work, and it's because they're good ideas. So this also illustrates the two particular key concepts that make Kanban different, and the way we understand what we're doing. One of them is accepting a work in process limit. We'll talk about that in some detail. And it goes hand in hand with the idea that we pull work through the system as we are ready for it, rather than pushing new work into the system when we perceive that there is capacity. And that really is where the idea of flow comes from, and flowing work through in a maximum efficient way. So here's what most people's initial experience of Kanban is actually about, and this takes us back to the original definition of Kanban, which is the visual card or the visual board. So probably at its most literal interpretation, this is where Kanban is. This is what it's about. It's the visual board or visual representation of work. When we first start putting Kanban into place in an organization, we want to start by visualizing the work as they are doing it now. So this might be whatever steps or stages your organization may have. Kanban is particularly effective for teams that have compliance requirements where they have very specific, possibly regulatory stage gates or quality gates or steps that have to be performed. These are really nice because it allows you to put those in place, see where they are, and some of those may be non-negotiable. And then as you're working on making your process improvements, you're going to work around those things that are mandated that have to be kept in place. It can be hard to work those into some other more prescriptive methodologies. So here on the Kanban board, I will first tell you my absolute favorite thing about this particular board and why I use it is the South Park avatars. You'll recognize those as being characters in the style of South Park. And you yourself can go online to South Park Studios and create your own custom avatars that look like your team members. I got to do this for my team several years ago, and it was one of the most fun parts about my job. Why do we care about silly things like that? Partly because we want the team to feel represented. We want them to feel it's their board, and we kind of want them to have fun with it. If they start doodling cartoons in the empty spaces on the board, I say you're doing something right. That also kind of highlights that although this is clearly a computer-generated board, we really are talking about physical boards that are physically present in the team's space, boards that they interact with. And so this is what our starting point is. We're going to have columns that represent the states of work for your team, the process that you follow currently, the team members that you currently have, and then we'll start to introduce certain improvements in the process. So we've got at the top of the board, oh, let me get my cool laser pointer working here. We've got at the top of the board the steps that we go through across the top. We've got the work represented by little white cards here, and you can see that the larger amounts of work are broken down into smaller tasks that are associated. And then over here in the dev area, you can see that this larger story has been broken down into some subtasks. Some of those subtasks are done, some are actively being worked on, and one is blocked. What I love about this board is the fact that we've actually got, lorem ipsum dolor on the individual cards, but even when we can't see what the cards specifically say, we can get a quick glance at this board and have a pretty good idea of what this team is doing and what their status is, what the state of their various items of work are. What people are doing. So even without all the other details, even if we can't read the language this board is in, we can learn things that are useful to know about the state of this team. Here's where we have maybe a next step that a team might introduce at the bottom here. Each one of these columns, whatever they may be, and remember that these are your steps. They don't have to be the steps that are on this slide. At the bottom, we have definitions of done, where what it means to be done with analysis is spelled out so that everybody on the team understands and agrees that that's what done with analysis means. Here in development, even though it's headed as development, there's an element of testing that's occurring in the development column, and that, to me, is as it should be. That may not be the state of things for your team currently, but it's a nice goal to get to where you've got developers working on some testing and validation of their code. And then you have an acceptance column where that acceptance level testing is being done. And all of that is stuff where the team as a whole has agreed on those things, and they've put them out there for everyone to see so that we all agree that these are the things that I mean when I move something into the done column. So that's that idea of making policies explicit, whatever those are, what the columns are, what the done states mean, what we do when something is blocked, what we do when we need to expedite an item. Any of those policies that you have as a team, talk them over, get agreement, and then put something up that shows everybody, here's what we agreed on that we would do. I am emphasizing as well that you're going to do these things by team agreement. You're not going to do them by fiat. One of the classic mistakes that folks make when they're trying to get started with Kanban is that they really want to put up a board with states that represent the work they wish they were doing, or the process they wish they were following, or the process that somebody's told them they ought to be following. And it's awfully important to start from where you actually are with a really honest assessment of what your process is, even if it's kind of a mess. Actually, especially if it's kind of a mess. You want everybody to be honest about it, and you want not to punish people for being honest, but rather to use that as the truth so that they also can inspect and make really well-informed decisions about what the real things are that really need to be fixed. It can be hard to do that in some cultures. I don't mean culture, I mean in some business cultures, especially if you have something like upper management coming by and criticizing what's on your board. That can be hard to deal with. You need some good management support there to make sure that the team feels good about being honest and is rewarded for that. So finally, I'll look at one more thing on this board, which is this idea here of the working process limits at the top. This won't be something that you start with when you first create your board. You'll introduce these over time. I think it's a better idea to start the board with the work that you have now and observe how it flows through the system without any new rules. Just see where you're at. And then you'll start to get an idea of work in process limits that might make sense and where to put them. Let me talk about what a work in process limit is about and why it's there. One of the goals that we have in Lean and in Kanban is to keep work from piling up. Because any work that piles up is wasteful. Any work that we do that does not immediately progress to delivering value to the customer is waste. And that might mean, for example, writing more detailed requirements than we can implement right now. If we have a backlog of detailed requirements being written that aren't being implemented, those are waste. Because the situation may change, you may have to go back and rewrite them later. The longer they sit around without being implemented, the less well understood they are. You don't get immediate feedback from the developers back to the analysts telling them, this was a good requirement, this was really useful, I was able to write well from it, or I wasn't and I need you to change these things about it. You really want all of that stuff to be as close to real time as you can. If the requirements are sitting around in a folder gathering dust, and then you pull them out and dust them off and try to remember what they meant and then try to implement them, you're losing a lot of the value of the analysis work that was done. And so what you want to try to do is, if you observe that your normal process results in a lot of analysis piling up that is more than the developers can do, you want to address that. And there's a number of ways you want to address it, but the first thing you want to do is just start addressing it by saying, we're not going to be working on any more than what we can accomplish. Now, where do you go to solve the problem of analysis piling up? Is it because you have too many analysts, not enough developers? Is it a resourcing issue? Is it because the developers have some other impediment that's slowing their work down further down the line, and that's backing up all the way into analysis? Is it actually a problem that stuff isn't going into test quickly enough? There are a lot of reasons, and it will depend on your organization as to what the most important reason is. So that's where you step back and you examine the whole process. We talked about, early on, we talked about Taiichi Ohno and the manufacturing line. And this is where we can bring in an example from manufacturing that, even though we're not manufacturers, is a really good metaphor for the kind of stuff that we want to do in our software development process. At Toyota, they are particularly known for, this is an anecdote that is frequently told about their line, that every employee who works the assembly line putting together a Toyota vehicle has access to a cord that they can pull, that if something has gone wrong on the assembly line, if a part comes to them and it is of substandard quality, if something's been done incorrectly, if they see a problem or even an opportunity to make it better, anything that they may see, they can pull the cord. And that's anybody, anywhere along the line. There's no idea of people who are worthy of having access to the cord and who are not. Everybody does by virtue of being there. And when they do that, the entire assembly line stops until the problem has been addressed, while the problem is being addressed. And everybody along the entire assembly line is going to stop what they're doing and think about this problem or opportunity and figure out what the best thing is to do to solve it. The reason I love this, couple of things. One is that it's wonderful, radical empowerment of the team down to the lowliest member of the team. There's no such thing as a lowly member of the team. So anybody on the team gets to tell the truth about the process. That's listened to, and it's incorporated into the process. And we start the assembly line back up again after we've fixed that problem. It makes people feel great about their jobs because they matter. So I love that about that part of the process. The other thing that I think is really important is that everybody on the team has a responsibility for that quality issue, whether it belonged to them. I'm making air quotes about that. Whether it was their fault or not, it doesn't matter. The whole team has a stake in the quality of the final product. And the final thing, and here's where I'm going to tie this back to software and where I think it matters in software, is the understanding that if a substandard quality item came to me down this assembly line and I see it here, it doesn't mean that I created the substandard thing. And it doesn't even mean that the person immediately before me created it. It could have been many, many, many steps further up the line that the problem was initially introduced. And we understand that the symptom may not become visible until I try to put this extra widget on or attach this other part, and now I can't do it effectively. But it could have been 3 or 4 or 10 steps before it ever reached me. It may be people I never even talked to. And that is true for us in software as well. So, for example, when we have a big holdup here in the acceptance, if we have tests piling up that aren't getting completed, or we have a lot of work that's going from the acceptance back into development for rework, the problem appears, the symptom appears down here in this part of the board. But the reality is, we know that it could very well have come from improper levels of analysis being done, the wrong requirements being written, lack of communication between the analysts and the testers. If they're not on the same page, they're not testing the things that the analyst originally wrote. Or it could come from even further up the chain in the customer not expressing themselves clearly, or in us prioritizing the wrong things to be done. All of those are things that can cause a symptom to emerge all the way at the end of the process. It's really nice if you have this little tester guy here has the ability to pull a cord and stop everything and say, let's talk about what the product owner or the customer or the analyst or the executives can do that would make this process more efficient. So I think all of that becomes really important. Again, I'll invite all of you guys to use the IM panel to send any comments or questions along if you have anything as we're going along, and I will address those as I have time. I may not have as much time today as we would like because we're cutting it short. Okay, I'm going to very quickly walk through some examples, and we've got URLs here as well that you'll be able to dig in and examine these at greater detail yourself. Examples of different shapes of Kanban boards. So we looked at a really nice example, but then these are some different ways of managing work as it's coming across, visualizing your work, and then possibly restructuring or reorganizing it. So this one is a pretty straightforward, it's very similar to the one we just looked at, where we're moving through items in a linear flow. And we've got individual work and process limits on each one of these columns. So fairly straightforward. Here we have an idea of a top-level state, which is it's in analysis more generally. But then, for example, if the analysis team is more than one person or has more than one substate, it might mean that you want to document that it goes through a sub-process as well. All of this provides you more visibility into, not just is it done or not, but how close is it to being done, what's left to be done on it. Or if you want to impose additional work in process limits on these individual columns, so that you have 5 things in analysis, but you don't want them all piled up in UX prototyping, because perhaps you have limited resources there. So you want to make sure that there's a subflow as well. Really simple states, doing and done. There are lots of Kanban folks who say that all Kanban boards eventually devolve into to-do, doing, and done. And I think that might be true. As your team develops better ways of communicating and other stuff that they do, it could be that the level of detail of states becomes less necessary. On the other hand, I said up top, you may have certain states that are not negotiable by you. They may be required by your organization or by regulatory compliance. Doesn't matter. These are just options for you. If doing and done tells the story that you want to tell, gives your team the information it needs to make improvements, go for it. Here's an example of multiple workflows, and I think this is a particularly good example of particular multiple workflow. Specifically, we've got the idea that the team is going along doing their regular work up at the top, flowing things through, but every once in a while you may have a show-stopping production bug that emerges. And that's one of the criticisms of something like Scrum, that it can be a little bit more difficult within Scrum to accommodate something that emerges in the middle of an iteration. There are ways in Scrum to deal with that, but there are teams that have real challenges with that. In Kanban, you can create the idea of an expedite flow where you have a limit of 1 item that is in there at any given time. Notice they're violating their limit, by the way. You can do that. But what that would do is it gives you high visibility that you are routing this thing through the system as quickly as possible. And it might mean that you are pausing or delaying the work up top, but you're not getting rid of the work up top and you don't throw it away. You just have a way of, when these emerge, they get zipped through as quickly as you can do them. Parallel workflow might be where you have something that comes into your system, you split it out into a couple of different things that are being worked on. So notice this is the same story, having 2 things done in parallel because they might be different parts of your team. And then when both of these are done, it'll come out into the done column or whatever that next state is. Let's see, Conwhip is the idea where you have a combined work in process limit for the entire board, and you don't have it on the individual columns. You just have an idea that altogether you don't want more than 7 things in here. That can work for some teams. There are disadvantages to it as well. For example, if all 7 things are piled up in build and these other columns are idle. It depends on whether that suits the way your team is organized. Alrighty. I talked a little bit about pull, and I wanted to go back to one of our earlier slides and show you kind of what pulling work through the system really means. So I'm going to go back up to my favorite South Park slide. And we'll talk about, because here's where we talked about trying to address queues. There we go. We talked about addressing queuing and work piling up in particular places, but what I didn't really do was draw the connection between that and pulling work through the system. It's a really, really different way of thinking about work, and I want to say that it's one of the most radical parts of Kanban, one of the biggest mind shifts about Kanban, and it's something where executives sometimes have a difficult time dealing with, or traditional managers in dealing with this, and it's really important to be able to leverage the language of lean and the concepts around lean to explain why this is a better way to organize your work, because I think it is. So in this board, we have the idea that there is a work in process limit. So that's where we start to enforce the rules that are going to create a flow and a pull mentality on our team. So, for example, we've got 2 items can be in this acceptance column at any one time. And if you've been paying attention, you've noticed something clever about how this works that, again, is a little bit counterintuitive, but is very important to making pull work effectively. And that is the fact that this work in process limit of 2 applies to the entire column, both doing and done. And so what that means is that if the acceptance testers move both of their items into the done column, now I'll be honest with you, I don't know what the criteria are on this board for pulling them into production, but it may be deploying, something like that. If there's 2 items sitting here in the done column and more stuff in development like this piece right here is ready, they can't just accept it because they are at their limit. And so something has to happen to clear this done column, probably deploy to production, so that now they have the entire column empty and they can accept more work. When that occurs, they can now come back to development and pull this story. Similarly, you can see that the development column's work in process limit is 3, and that applies to both their doing and done, not just doing. So if they have 3 items here and all 3 of these items get to be done, the analyst can't just give them more work and have them start working on it. This work in process limit means they don't accept new work until the testers have pulled this out of this column and moved it through the system. Again, this is all about pull. It's about the folks to the right saying, looking back up the chain and saying, I am ready to accept more work and I'm going to pull it through the system, rather than the developers saying, here's a bunch more work whether you are ready for it or not. The first thing that this does is it eliminates queuing, because you don't have a queue any larger than your work in process limit at any time. You have 3 things here, and you can't pile work up. This is where managers and executives in particular, but I'll be honest, also developers, testers, analysts, and the members of your team start to panic a little bit because, oh my gosh, what happens now? There's nothing for me to do. I'm idle. Well, okay. You're not really idle if you think of yourselves as being part of the entire team, if you go back to that assembly line metaphor with the cord, right? So if this group of developers here has 3 items in the done column and they are not able to accept new work because their work in process limit has been reached, then they shouldn't be playing solitaire. This is not a time for Minesweeper. It is a time for them to look around and say, wait a minute. Normally, this stuff would be pulled out of my done column in an expedited fashion, and I'd be able to pull new work in. Why isn't that happening? What's going on down here in acceptance that is not allowing them to pull this work? And that leads to the obvious next question, and how can I help with that? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to turn developers into acceptance testers, because we all know they suck at that, but it does mean that the whole team should be looking at the whole flow of the whole board. If all the developers do is look at this section of the board right here, your team's mentality is not in the right place. They're not thinking of you as a unified team that is everybody responsible for bringing work from this column all the way out to production. They shouldn't just be looking here and saying, well, I don't have anything to do. They should be looking at all the phases of the board and saying, can I help with that work by actually helping them do it? Or can I help with that work by identifying a change in the process that will allow this work to move forward more smoothly? And that's when the whole team should be talking about, why did we have a place that we created, where did we create idleness and waste, and how can we clear it? You don't solve the problem by ignoring it and continuing to shove work into the system. You solve it by stopping and inspecting it. So that's what that's about. The work in process limits are meant to force you to do that inspection and figure out something's impeding the smooth flow of work. How do we resolve it? Alrighty. Let's move back through here because I'm going to talk about another value to that radical visibility and with a case study. This is a case study that Stephen worked on, and so I will tell his story as best I can, and he'll correct me because he's sitting behind me if I make any errors. But basically, we're at a customer, and we've got a Kanban board where you can see this is, it looks like 2. It's been split because it doesn't fit on the page because it's huge. It's lots of states, lots of steps, and lots of stuff that is required by their company's process. And so this is where we are simply visualizing it the way it exists when we get there. And we've got tons and tons and tons of work. It's a very large team. And you can see where we've got the individual state columns, and we've got a count of the work that's in each one of these states at the top. And we've got stuff going through a design process, through a coding process, through a testing process, into deployment and done. And this makes sense that we would have this. And so this is what life looks like when we first get there. And you can see right away that there's something that maybe doesn't look exactly optimal. Just, again, we don't know what these items are, but we know that it doesn't look super good that there's so many things sitting in these sign-off columns. And what we know from our experience at this company is that those things sit in those sign-off columns for a long time. So we're looking at one day's snapshot of the board, but the reality is all kinds of stuff is happening where that stuff is just sitting and sitting and sitting and sitting in those queues. And as you can see, the other things that are in between are somewhat starved for work. But there's a conversation that's had in the company to talk about these sign-off queues, and the company's pretty firm that those are necessary, they're part of the process, they just have to happen. And one of the things that emerges is that we understand that pretty much one, maybe two individual people out of these very large teams are responsible for doing these various kinds of sign-off, and they're pretty much just in the habit of letting all the sign-offs pile up until they can do them all at once. So we've got a current state here where we're talking about this, we're not getting any traction, it's not really getting addressed. We've got a lot of stuff on the board, but of the stuff that's on the board, when we do a full count, we've got a relatively small number of stories actively being worked on, and we've got an awful lot of stories that are just waiting. Because these waiting queues are really just, that's all they are, is they're not being worked on to be signed off. What this means is they're waiting to be signed off. Okay. And then we've only delivered 10 stories. So here's the next problem. One day, somebody comes in and takes their sign-off queue and says, oh, there's tons of stuff in here. Let me sign off all of it at once. Boom! It hits the poor coders and the poor testers all at once, and now all of a sudden, they've had tons of stuff dumped on them, and they have to scramble. So they've gone from waiting and being starved for work to being dumped on and being overworked. And none of that sounds like a smooth flow. That sounds like a really jerky assembly line with lots of stops and starts. We know that that's intrinsically wasteful, but we can also see the symptoms of it in the ways that the coding team and the testing team are affected when this happens. Well, we're not the customer. We have conversations about it. Yeah, we've got 40 stories in progress, not so many stories waiting. We have these conversations, and we don't seem to really get anywhere in just kind of talking about that it would be nice to change this process. So we do this clever and slightly evil thing. The company happens to have a baseline of loads of metrics. So they understand things like how much they pay their people per day and how that breaks down to the amount of work that they produce in hours and how much. Anyway, they've got numbers, which any of us could probably come up with plausible seeming numbers on our teams as well, to express the monetary value of wait time. So when something's not moving through the system, when it is waiting and not actively being worked on, we have a way to monetize that using the company's own data that they've provided. Not everybody has this right now sitting there waiting to be reported on, but it's oftentimes something that we can do. And this is the big stick that maybe your company doesn't need it. Maybe you figured out just by virtue of looking at flow that didn't seem optimal. In this case, the conversations weren't getting where we wanted them to be, so we did this. We put some numbers up on the board. And when I say we put numbers up on the board, this is a computer representation of it, but we actually put them in the team's space, facing out into the hallway, so that people wandering by would see not just the board and all the states, but this thing with a really attention-getting $sign on it. I don't think we highlighted in yellow on the board. I think we just put it up there. But, nothing clarifies the mind like a $sign. And so somebody walks by and says, hey, wait a minute. What's that number mean? That's a very large dollar figure. And we say, oh, don't worry about that. That's nothing. We just wanted to track the impact of some of the things on this board. It's just, we know that the person who's responsible for this column on the board is really, really, really busy, and so they don't have time to sign off on things really effectively, but it's just trivia. Don't worry about it. And so we're able to express that, and in this case, this really literally is one person who's just not signing off on things in an expeditious manner. And we've got this number up there, and the number kind of speaks for itself. And then this miraculous thing happened. Just kind of out of nowhere, suddenly stuff started to get signed off as it hit the queue instead of waiting and being done in big batches. Again, maybe they found some reason to be really motivated to do that. But look at this board. Isn't this board awesome? This is an awesome, healthy board. This is what Kanban wants, because it wants things to flow smoothly through. And as you start getting those elongated, little, narrow, skinny lines instead of big, chunky cues, you know you're doing something right. Just visually, we don't have to know what these stories are. We can see that they are flowing through the queue smoothly. And now we have some statistics that we really, really, really like. We've got 13 things in process. We've only got 4 things that are being waited on. We've got a WIP limit of 1, maybe. I don't know if we enforce a WIP limit or not, but we've got the concept that, hey, let's get this stuff out of that queue, and in some cases that's good enough. And we've got tons and tons and tons of stories being delivered, meaning deployed, meaning value. So they're not sitting around wastefully. So it's a great story. And then these were some of the observations. Again, company with lots of metrics. We're able to know that the work waiting for sign-off reduced by over 80%. People were no longer multitasking. And the work in process reduced dramatically, and that meant that we're putting value through the system very quickly and getting it to the customer. That's where it belongs. We don't need value to be sitting around in queues. We need it out to the customer. None of us really have that kind of time to wait, right? It's got to get out there where they can see it. So one of the reasons that people get a little freaked out about pulling the cord and letting people be idle and inspecting these problems is that the idea is that somehow it is a virtue to keep everybody busy. And I want to say that keeping everybody busy a lot of times just means keeping them looking busy, right? Because if they're not directly working on something of value to the customer that's going to get out to the customer really quickly, what are they working on? So this is one of the reasons that it can be really challenging, is the idea of that very smooth flow through the system. As you are working towards it, when you have those gaps in the assembly line, when you have those places where stuff builds up and stuff is slow here and frantic here and there's other places, there will be periods of time where outside observers will not feel like every single individual on your team is as busy as they could be. And you've really got to change the way of thinking on your teams, because when we look at something that is working at full capacity, that is at full capacity, or that is absolutely completely utilized, this is the metaphor that kind of makes a lot of sense for us in software. And it works for an assembly line as well, really, right? If you have something that is packed with every inch occupied, it's not actually working very effectively. It's not being used. It's just full. And in our world of software, that's oftentimes experienced with our teams. We have a huge full backlog. We have lots of stuff to be worked on. We're always going to be busy, but that doesn't mean we're going to be effective any more than this road is being effective right now. It's just full. So we want to reframe the conversation. We really want to reevaluate what our priorities are, and that the priorities should be at the end of the queue. What's coming out to customers? What's being delivered, and how quickly is that? Because as we optimize, as we take the painful steps we need in the middle to optimize our flow through the queue, we are improving our team's ability to predictably deliver value. And that's the ultimate goal. What you want is to get to a place where something hits that starting queue on the left, and you have a pretty good idea that if it's at the top of that queue, it is going to fly through the system and be out to the customer very quickly. That's where you start to build up that trust and the ability for the customer to believe that you're going to be giving them what they want, and executives as well. All right, wrap up. Let's talk about when you might consider Kanban as a good fit for your organization. I didn't spend too awfully much time contrasting with other methodologies, because that's not what you're here to hear about. You're here to hear about Kanban. But Kanban is a really good fit for organizations when you want to really understand your current process and how it got that way and why you do those things before you make any big changes to it. A lot of other methodologies, past and present, are more prescriptive and more out of the box, so that they'll say, do all of these things. Scrum is a good example of that, but XP was an example of it back in the day. Any number of prescriptive methodologies where they say, stop doing what you're doing now and do this instead. Fine. Kanban is not that. Kanban is definitely about starting from where you are. And you document your existing process, warts and all, and then you identify the highest priority areas to change, make improvements. It works really well when you already have a strong problem-solving culture. And I say this because a lot of organizations have folks at the team level who have been shoving stuff into the suggestion box for years and years and years and are frustrated because they see so many opportunities and they're not being listened to. Kanban is a great fit for these organizations because it is about radically empowering your team, starting to listen to those folks. When their ideas didn't make sense, seemed kind of crazy, how do you fit them in? How do you talk through them as a whole team and make those things work? Because they know a lot of stuff. And when we're doing stuff top down, we don't always hear that feedback. So Lean is also about really respecting the people, taking advantage of that problem-solving skill set that you may already have. This will also help you with your job satisfaction and your turnover rates. Wow, cool. Or if you need a lot of flexibility in the different roles on your teams or the way your teams interact with each other, Kanban, again, because it's not radically changing how you do business yet, it's going to give you that flexibility, and it's going to allow you to evolve your processes into more efficient processes over time gradually. That allows you to do it throughout your entire organization in a less disruptive way, and that can be really powerful. Kanban is not necessarily a good fit in some other cases, or may need to be approached differently in other cases. If the process that you have now is a mess, if it's very unclear how things work, if it's chaotic or people don't agree, then it can, in some cases, be really beneficial to just sweep the slate clean and start over with a whole new process, get everybody on board with a whole new one. If it's very politicized, if there's a lot of, individual sort of tribal behavior, you can also kind of clean that out by starting fresh and saying, you know what, we're all going to change our process and we're all going to do something new. That would be different from Kanban most of the time. Another real challenge with Kanban is the opposite of what I just said. If you don't have a good problem-solving culture, if you don't have a good sense that we're in this together and we're going to solve problems rather than just pointing fingers or blaming. So blaming is a problem. Now, it's a problem in all other methodologies as well, so let's be clear about that. It's not very productive. But if you have folks who can clearly visualize the problem, but then you can't make a clear path to solving those problems. If you're just stuck, you say, well, gosh, I don't know, we tried 7 different things and they didn't work. Or you argue, I want to solve it this way, I want to solve it this other way. If any number of things that would cause you to be stalled out in the problem-solving portion, you're going to either need help with that, or you might consider a methodology where there's a little bit more structure so that you can solve those things a little bit more effectively. Either way, no matter what you do, Kanban is going to be very disruptive and painful in the long term in your organization. You have a little bit more control over when you take that pain, but you need not to shy away from it. I added this slide just this morning. This is my new favorite slide. There are some reasons to choose Kanban. Some teams are gravitating towards Kanban because they think, bottom line, that it will be that they've been told to do Scrum, and they think Kanban somehow is going to get them out of the things they don't like about Scrum. And I'm going to tell you right now that it won't. It's not any easier. It's not any less painful. If you find that Kanban is a lot less painful than other methodologies, it probably means you're not trying hard enough to solve problems. It probably means you're not doing it well. So don't choose Kanban if you don't like agile methodologies that tell you to break stories down into small, understandable parts. The boards that we looked at all had stories broken down into tasks, and you know that you want stories to flow swiftly through the system. Those are not stories that are going to sit on the board for 6 months. We are not talking about, phase level items on a board. Yeah, you can visualize those if you want, but you're not going to get that smooth flow through the system. You're not going to address problems at the assembly line level. If you find that you've been trying to do time-boxed iterations and you're accepting work into those iterations and then you can't get it done, Kanban's not going to help you solve the problems that cause that. I mean, it's going to help you solve them, but it's not going to take away the need to solve that problem. It means you have a fundamental problem. If you want to swap out members of the team and have a lot of shifting in membership on the teams, and Kanban will quote unquote let you do that, but it doesn't mean it's a good thing to do. So if you don't have all the roles represented, if you don't have all the skills you need to deliver software over time, you're going to have a lot of variability and craziness in your process, and that's it's going to be very hard for Kanban to help you become efficient that way. The URL for this article, which explains a lot of these in greater detail, is at the bottom here, and I'm happy to provide this slide deck as well to anybody who would like it. But definitely check that article out. It's a couple years old, but I think it's fantastic, and it links to 5 really good reasons to choose Kanban, many of which we've talked about today, and so I would encourage you to check that out. Bottom line, Kanban's not easy. If it's easy, you're not doing it right. You're not trying hard enough to really solve fundamental problems. Or Your organization is already developing software perfectly and you don't need a process to help you. I suspect you would not be here if you thought that was the case. So then this is the big risk of Kanban if you don't do it correctly. This is another, it's all about the South Park, right? This is a screenshot I've snagged from an early season South Park episode. The problem is you put Kanban in place, but then if you don't know what to do